Good afternoon. I'm Paul DiRienzo, host of The Torch. Trump gave a speech outlining his defense plans, especially space-based weapons, before an audience at the Pentagon. But first, he compared the border wall he's being denied by Congress to defense against nuclear attack.
We will always be at the forefront of everything. Fourth, we will recognize that space is a new warfighting domain, with the Space Force leading the way. My upcoming budget will invest in a space-based missile defense layer. It's new technology. It's ultimately going to be a very, very big part of our defense and obviously of our offense. The system will be monitored, and we will terminate any missile launches from hostile powers or even from powers that make a mistake. It won't happen, regardless of the missile type or geographic origins of the attack. We will ensure that enemy missiles find no sanctuary on Earth or in the skies above. This is the direction that I'm heading. We have some very bad players out there, and we're a good player, but we can be far worse than anybody if need be. I've always known, and I've watched and I've seen, the stronger you are, the less you will need whatever that strength may be. Fifth, we will remove bureaucratic obstacles to dramatically speed up the acquisition and deployment of the new technology. And sixth, we will insist on fair burden sharing with our allies.
Trump, in his Pentagon speech, declared that space is the new warfighting domain, and he vowed that the U.S. will develop an unrivaled missile defense system to protect against advanced hypersonic and cruise missile threats from competitors and adversaries. While Trump was repeating plans in the works under several presidents, his belligerent tone has arms experts worried. The director of Disarmament and Threat Reduction at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., is Kingston Reif. He says Trump's statements are probably leaving China and Russia confused over what exactly is U.S. nuclear policy. Reif goes on to explain the logic behind the balance of terror strategy of MAD, mutually assured destruction.
The Trump administration unveiled a long-anticipated policy review on missile defense. And in general, the review proposes a significant and costly expansion of the role and scope of U.S. missile defenses that, in my view, is likely to exacerbate Russian and Chinese concerns about the threat missile defenses pose to their strategic nuclear arsenals. Now, the President spent a good deal of time in his speech discussing the role of space in enhancing U.S. missile defense capabilities. In particular, he noted that the administration will be more aggressively pursuing the development of a space-based sensor layer, meaning that the Pentagon will seek to develop satellites to put in space to help detect and track adversary ballistic missiles that might be launched against the United States or U.S. allies. Currently, the United States has radars based on the ground on planet Earth that do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to attempting to track and detect missiles, and putting sensors in space to assist with detection and tracking would, in theory, strengthen the overall capability of our missile defenses. One area that the Missile Defense Review did not recommend immediately proceeding on was putting actual interceptors in space that would seek to eliminate adversary ballistic missiles as they are being launched and leaving Earth's atmosphere for the vacuum of space on the way to their targets. This has been a very controversial issue ever since President Ronald Reagan first proposed it as part of his Star Wars initiative. pursuing space-based interceptors would be immensely costly, would be very difficult to achieve technically, and would be massively destabilizing insofar as it would likely prompt Russia and China to take significant steps to increase the quantity and quality of their nuclear forces out of concern that interceptors in space might pose a threat to them. So the Missile Defense Review proposes to further study the concept of putting interceptors in space, and it remains to be seen whether the Pentagon will propose to eventually pursue them.
Is there anything in the president's proposals that is different from what has been proposed by past presidents? Does he add anything that hasn't been mentioned before?
There is a fair amount of continuity with the past U.S. approach, the approach of previous administrations on missile defense. However, there are also some significant departures. So, for example, the review expands the purpose of missile defense to defend not only against ballistic missiles, but also to defend against cruise missiles and an emerging type of missile threat known as hypersonic missiles. The review also proposes to more aggressively defend against Russian and Chinese regional missile threats. By regional missile threats, I mean shorter, medium, even intermediate range missiles. The review also proposes to augment the defense of the U.S. homeland with an additional type of interceptor known as the SM-3 Block 2A, which could be capable of intercepting intercontinental ballistic missiles. Right now, the United States has one system that is designed to defend the U.S. homeland, and that system is known as the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense System. There are a total of currently 44 interceptors in Alaska and California associated with that system, and it's designed to defend against a limited attack against North Korea or Iran. And one of my concerns about this review is that in adding this additional interceptor capability that I mentioned, this will exacerbate concerns that Russia and China have about our missile defenses potentially threatening their offensive nuclear forces.
So this is about threatening other people's missiles, their ability to... Why is it so dangerous or destabilizing? Tell us, why is it so destabilizing to target a adversary's actual missiles, not their cities and not their infrastructure, but their missiles?
The nuclear relationship between the United States and Russia, and also the United States and China as well, has long been characterized as one of mutually assured destruction, whereby each side has sufficiently survivable and capable nuclear forces that attempting to target or eliminate those nuclear forces simply isn't feasible. But when you introduce missile defense into the equation, and this has been a particular concern of Russia and in China, is that missile defenses potentially could allow the United States to eliminate a significant portion or prevent a significant portion of Russia or China's missile forces from attacking the continental United States, which would raise concerns in the minds of Moscow and Beijing about the adequacy of their nuclear forces. So in the past, advances in missile defense have led to increases in offensive nuclear forces. Now, there was a treaty during the Cold War, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty between the United States and Russia, that limited the amount of missile defense interceptors that each side could have capable of intercepting long-range missiles because of concern about the destabilizing of effects of missile defense that I just mentioned. But the George W. Bush administration withdrew from this treaty early in its first term, and there are currently no limits on U.S. missile defenses. And this is as the United States has sought additional missile defense capabilities, particularly in response to growing North Korean missile threat. And these capabilities the development of these capabilities is completely open-ended and unconstrained. This has raised concerns in Moscow and Beijing about their ability to continue to maintain a sufficient level of deterrence. And I think the Missile Defense Review that was released today by the administration, which proposes additional steps to expand the scope and scale of U.S. defenses, will worsen those concerns.
So this might be to the average listener somewhat confusing that, in fact, by strengthening America's defense against an attack, we're actually provoking the other side into developing more missiles to try and overcome our ability.
That's correct. One of the great paradoxes of missile defense is that the United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars since the 1950s in an effort to field effective missile defenses. And what we've got out of that investment is a limited capability against a small number of relatively unsophisticated missile threats. Russia and China can certainly overwhelm our current defenses, but nonetheless, the mere existence of these defenses and, worst case scenario planning in Russia and China raises concerns for them about our defensive capabilities and the fact that there are no limits on our defenses. They're completely unconstrained. They're constantly worried about the future and what technological advancements we might be able to make. So that's kind of the paradox of missile defense. In reality, it provides a very limited capability, but nonetheless it inspires great concern and anxiety, particularly in Russia and China, which has prompted them and could prompt them to further make quantitative and especially qualitative improvements to their nuclear forces.
It keeps the sort of like the spiral of
exactly
weapon
right.
to construction going higher and higher. Everybody's trying to one up each, but it's like that game where you try and pick who's going to bat first, and you put your hand on the bat. And
the United States is not alone in pursuing missile defense. Our program is the most comprehensive. We spend the most money on it, but Russia and China are increasingly investing in missile defense, and even the United States is increasingly pointing to Russian and Chinese missile defenses as reasons why we need to modernize and upgrade our offensive nuclear forces.
What do you think of the tone of it? It was very different from the tone of past presidents, even when they talk tough. He has almost a frightening lilt to his voice when he talks about this stuff, like he would use it in a heartbeat.
Well, of course, he began the speech at the Defense Department in front of U.S. military personnel with an attack on Democrats for their approach to border security and for being the cause of the government shutdown. So right from the get-go, it was a very partisan speech at what is one of the most revered and nonpartisan institutions in American society, the U.S. military, or it's at least viewed that way by most Americans. But the president, in his unique style, did use a lot of hyperbole when talking about the issue. For example, apropos our previous conversation about the potential destabilizing effects of missile defense, the president stated that the goal of U.S. missile defenses was to, quote, ensure we can detect and destroy any missile launched against the United States anywhere, anytime, any place, end quote. Now, that is not actually what the review says. The review proposes to expand the scope of U.S. defenses to defend against regional missile threats anywhere, anytime, any place, but not to defend the U.S. homeland against Russian or Chinese nuclear attack. Longstanding U.S. policy has been to only defend the U.S. homeland against limited attacks from North Korea or Iran, because attempting to defend in the entire continental United States against the far more sophisticated missile threat posed by Russia and China would be unaffordably expensive, unachievable technically, and massively destabilizing. So right there was a disconnect between what the review says and what the president was opining. And of course, that's not the first time that this has happened, and Beijing and Moscow may understandably be wondering whether what the president says is U.S. policy or whether the review is U.S. policy.
Kingston Reif is the Director of Disarmament and Threat Reduction at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., and the Doomsday Clock that tells the world how close humanity is to annihilation will remain at 2 minutes to midnight. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a publication launched by the scientists who developed the first atomic bomb, says the world should not sleep easy, however. The clock's position hasn't been this close to midnight since 1953, when the Soviet Union exploded its first hydrogen bomb. Calling the current world situation the new abnormal, the magazine says the world faces two existential threats: nuclear weapons and climate change. Robert Rosner is a professor of astrophysics at the University of Chicago and director of the Argonne National Laboratory, where the first controlled fission experiment occurred. Rosner says he was at the start, says we are at the start of a new Cold War.
The closest the minute hand has been to midnight is, in fact, right now. The only other time when it's been this close, 2 minutes before midnight, is at the very height of the Cold War in 1953, when the Soviet Union had just exploded their very first hydrogen bomb. They had tested their hydrogen bomb. And at that time, we moved the minute hand to 2 minutes before midnight. Keep in mind that that was the time when Americans were busy building bomb shelters in their backyards. That was a scary time. Why is it significant? It's significant because that we didn't move it, because what we're saying is that we've entered a time of what you might call the new abnormal. We're at a time that is extremely unusual, and it's a very dangerous time. We're about to enter, for a number of reasons, a new international nuclear arms race. Both the United States and our adversaries, both the Russians and the Chinese, are developing new generations of nuclear weapons, of new delivery systems for delivering the nuclear weapons. We're talking and likely going to initiate a new kind of Star Wars enterprise of anti-missile missiles. And we're going to go back to building these weapons without, this time, talking to our adversaries. In the 1950s and 60s, we at least had background discussions with the Russians, with the Soviets. We kept if you like, the telephone lines busy. We had exchanges of scientists, Russian and U.S. and U.K. and French. We talked to each other. And that was part of the conference building that was necessary that ultimately led to us signing on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Russians signing on, the Chinese signing on. Today, we're not talking to our adversaries whatsoever. There is none of those exchanges are taking place today. Scientist to scientist, not going on. But we're building up our weaponry. Very, very scary.
Tell us a little bit about this Doomsday Clock, is how it arose and what it's supposed to really show us.
The folks that started the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists were the atomic scientists that had been involved in the Manhattan Project that led to the development of atomic bombs. And the folks that started the Bulletin were present at Alamogordo in New Mexico when Trinity, which is the very first atomic bomb ever, was exploded. And when they witnessed it, they all said the same thing, basically. They said, we're watching the development of the very first weapon developed by humans that's capable of wiping human life off the face of the earth. And they wanted to make public their fear as scientists, as the people that had developed these weapons, to say, hey, wait a second, we better think about this.
And that's Professor Rosner. He adds that the idea of the Doomsday Clock was developed to compare the threat to a well-known fairy tale, making the idea easier for the general public to understand.
As children, we know the story of Cinderella and the meaning of what it means to come to midnight, that midnight is a time of disaster. Things happen at midnight, and it's a doomsday time. And so there's a kind of a metaphor here that the time before midnight is an indication how close we are to disaster. We don't want to be at the disaster. We want to stay away from it. And so the way you should think about the Doomsday Clock is that it's a metaphor for telling us, watch out, think about what we're doing, and try to undo what we've been doing. Let's go back. Let's push the minute hand back for a minute.
So how did nuclear scientists come to embrace climate change as an existential threat similar to nuclear weapons?
We're doing things that are starting to have very long-term consequences for the world and for humanity. Is an idea that was only slowly developing, even among climate scientists. If you go back 20 years, there were very few climate scientists that really had in mind that we have a real problem. But I think over the past 20 years, in the science community, there's been a real revolution in understanding that we have a problem. And that revolution really was driven by scientists doing science, that is, understanding better what the data was telling us and developing better models, understanding the physics of what's going on. And today we're at the point where the science community is basically agreed that we have a problem.
What is your concern in this time with this president in particular, but it's more widespread than even that there's sort of a looking down on science? There was a time when the scientist in the 50s and 60s was seen as a heroic figure.
It's not a simple story, but I think there's a general issue, which is not a Trump issue, but it's a general issue of a kind of a war, information war, you might call it, which is basically busy erasing the difference between fact and fiction. That if you go to the web, you often don't know what to believe. That process of basically devaluing the importance of fact as opposed to fiction is something that is inimical to science, the way science proceeds. So the fact that science is being devalued the way that you described it, I think is in part just an outcome of this information war, what has happened to the web, this obscuration of the difference between fact and fiction.
And that's Professor Rosner of Argonne National Laboratory. He's Robert Rosner. He's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Chicago, and he was speaking about the fact that the minute hand is 2 minutes to midnight, signaling how close humanity is to annihilation unless we do something about nuclear weapons and climate change. The Bulletin, in a statement announcing the Doomsday Clock, says there is hope, claiming the world security situation can be improved if leaders seek change and citizens demand it. It's 2 minutes to midnight, but there's no reason the Doomsday Clock cannot move away from catastrophe. It has done so in the past because wise leaders acted under pressure from informed and engaged citizens around the world. January 15th marked what would have been Martin Luther King's 90th birthday, and for many Americans, the day is a time to reflect on his legacy and to hope for advances in racial equality yet to come. Yet the iconic civil rights leader's memory is also linked to his assassination by a single gunshot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. An assassination once thought settled with the arrest, conviction, escape, and rearrest of his alleged killer, James Earl Ray. Ray died in prison in 1998. After confessing to the crime and being sentenced to life, he recanted and maintained until his death that he was a pawn and not an assassin. It may not have been an important statement, but for the fact that members of the King family came to agree that someone else had killed Martin Luther King Jr. An attorney and author who has kept Ray's claim alive is William Pepper, who says Ray was not only innocent, but the pawn of then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
I'm an international human rights attorney. I represented the King family. Was close to Martin King the last year of his life. I convened the Seminar on International Human Rights at Oxford University. Written 3 books on the King case. The final book, The Plot to Kill King, revealed the truth about how Martin King was assassinated.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think this birthday he would have been 90, almost a century after his birth, half a century after his murder. Still, you feel that this case has not been closed. Why is that?
Well, the case is closed, but the Plot to Kill King closes the case. It establishes how he was killed with corroboration and how he was assassinated. James Earl Ray, of course, was originally coerced into pleading guilty. He died in 1998. I represented the King family in a 30-day, 70-witness trial in 1999, which pretty much cleared Ray and implicated the government and agents of the government of the United States, state of Tennessee, city of Memphis. That was done in 99, but the final truth was not able to come out until 2016 because I couldn't reveal a lot of information. We had a fear that witnesses would be killed.
Who would have done this killing? Who would have killed the witnesses?
The same forces that killed Martin King. The United States government was determined to get rid of him, and they were successful. I detail it, where the money came from, and how Hoover sent Clyde Tolson in with money, and how they organized the Dixie Mafia and what went on. So it was it's a pretty clear picture of the involvement in the assassination of the government of the United States. And in terms of this particular killing, the involvement of Hoover's office and Clyde Tolson as the go-between.
Who was Clyde Tolson?
Clyde Tolson was Hoover's number two. He was his lover and his deputy director, and he was his trusted errand boy for tasks like this.
What did you discover at the beginning, and what new information did you finally add to this case?
Basically what happened was that the hit was put on Martin it was finally organized in 1967. They arranged for James Earl Ray to be profiled and then escape from prison and then under control throughout the time that he was being used as a setup. Martin was induced to come into Memphis because of the sanitation workers' strike and the death of 2 sanitation workers. He was put up at the Lorraine Motel, which backed onto a brushy area. He stayed in room 306, where he never stayed before, despite the fact that Abernathy said that had always been their room. It had never been their room. He had never stayed there overnight. He used to meet with community groups there, that was all. He was in there, and he was set up as a target in room 306. He was to go out to dinner that night. Came out on the balcony. The best shot in the Memphis Police Department, Frank Strausser, was the designated shooter. We have witness that showed him practicing all day with a special rifle at the rifle range. But it was given to him. He left at 3 o'clock to go down and to meet with his spotter, who was Lieutenant Earl Clark. And the two of them went out in the bushes, in the bush area, before 6 o'clock, accompanied by Lloyd Jowers, who owned Jim's Grill, which was the bar that backed onto the bush area. They waited for King to come out on the balcony. When he came out on the balcony, he was shot, a single shot by Strausser, hit in the lower right part of his head, and the bullet went down and nicked the spine, and he was unconscious. He was then taken to St. Joseph's Hospital. They were working on him in the emergency room when the head of neurosurgery, Dr. Breen Bland, came in and told them all to get out and let that nigger die. As the emergency room team filed out, the last one leaving was Lula Mae Shelby. And she heard the Breen Bland and the 2 men in suits who were with him gather up spit in their throats, and then caught her attention as she was at the door. She turned, saw them spit on the body of King, who was on a catheter, and with catheters in his body. Then she saw Bland pull the catheters out and take the cushion, the pillow, from under his head, put it over his head, and suffocate him to death. And that was how Martin King was actually killed. He might have died from the bullet wound, but he was still alive, and they weren't taking any chances. She saw that. The next morning when she went home, she called her family together. She told them what she had seen, said she didn't know why they had to kill him. And years later, 40-odd years later, one of her sons who was at that meeting, now blind and diabetic, came under oath and told that whole story. Now, that's only one account, but we had another account of the youngest son of the Dixie Mafia family who were involved in organizing things on the ground. And he sat in on a meeting. Breen Bland was the family's personal physician. He sat in on a meeting between Bland and his elder brother. And he heard Bland say, if the bullet doesn't kill him, be sure you get him to St. Joseph's, where we'll make sure he doesn't leave there alive. So those are two separate independent accounts of what happened in terms of the assassination. But as far as we're concerned, and I go into considerable detail in the book, that is how Martin King ultimately was killed.
William Pepper is an attorney and author of An Act of State, The Plot to Kill King, The Truth Behind the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and Orders to Kill, The Truth Behind the Murder of Martin Luther King. In New Jersey last month, the state's assembly passed a number of bills aimed at tackling the issue of food insecurity in poor areas of the state, hunger on college campuses, food waste, and more. More than 919,000 New Jersey residents struggle with a lack of access to affordable, healthy food, according to the state. 1 in 9 residents in the state is food insecure. In New Jersey, 41 cities can be classified as food deserts, said Assembly Speaker Craig Coughlin of Middlesex, who sponsored some of the bills. He said to fight hunger effectively, we must address all possible sources of food insecurities for New Jersey families. But food insecurity in the world's richest country, the United States, remains a major problem, with millions facing hunger throughout the country. Andy Fisher is author of Big Hunger, the unholy alliance between corporate America and anti-hunger groups. He says hunger is built into the country's food system.
USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, measures what's called food insecurity, which is a measurement of experiences and behaviors related to hunger, because hunger is a difficult thing to measure. So it's been doing that since 1995, and the rates of food insecurity have gone up and down with the economy. As the economy goes south, those rates go north. The food insecurity has been dropping pretty significantly since the peak of the recession, but it's almost exactly at the same point as it was in 1995. 12% of the population is considered to be food insecure, and about 4% of the population is considered to be very food insecure with hunger. So you see over that time period that, we're not making progress. We're kind of stagnating around reducing hunger at kind of the macro level. And that's because of a number of different things. Federal food benefits like the SNAP program, or what used to be called food stamps, have stagnated, in some cases decreased. You see wages have generally stagnated. The minimum federal wage is still $7.25 an hour and has been for the past 8 or 9 years. And many states it is a bit higher, but in general it has not kept up with inflation and has not kept up with productivity. The purchasing power for minimum wage peaked in 1968. So even though we have an economic recovery, and even though we're starting to see some wage gains for the middle class and the working class, we see that most of the productivity gains have been captured by capital. So there's a big imbalance between who's profiting from all the technological innovations and the productivity gains of workers, and it's business rather than labor. So you see this entrenched lower class, this entrenched underclass that's emerged in our society, and people who are coming to food banks, which are about 46 million people who are relying on SNAP or food stamps is about the same number, a little bit less. It's been declining in recent years. Are folks who are working. 80% of people who rely on the SNAP program have at least one person in their household who is working. So it's not the welfare queens. It's not the myths that the Reagan administration and Republicans have been perpetuating for the past 30 or 40 years. It is honest folks who are striving to make a living and follow the American dream of working hard and making ends meet, but the system's rigged against them. The measurement that USDA uses has to do with people's behaviors and experiences, has to do with things like, do I have enough money to buy food at the end of the month? Do I eat different food when I run out of money? Do I worry about whether I'm going to have enough food to put on the table? Am I feeding my kids and not myself? Those experiences, perceptions, and behaviors that people have when things are tight. The cheapest foods per calorie are ones that are not the healthiest. So they're highly processed. Things like ramen, pasta, rice, starchy, high carbohydrate foods, highly processed foods that are cheap and fill people's bellies, but may be obesogenic, may be causing obesity, or just don't bring them the nutrients that they need to protect against disease and to live a healthy life.
This reporter remembers the days when government cheese was staple in college refrigerators and late-night comedy. Fisher says that the 1980s program has morphed into something much greater.
It has morphed into what's called TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program. So, the Department of Agriculture typically buys between $300 to $600 million of food every year. Some of it's based upon market conditions. That cheese was because there was a surplus of dairy in the country, so they bought that to support farmers. And so so USDA now buys a wide variety of foods, canned vegetables and fruits, beans, pasta, meat, dairy, things like that they then distribute to food banks. What's happened this year is because of the tariffs that the president's put on products, there's been retaliation by the Chinese and others, so there's been economic impacts felt by farmers, so the administration is now buying an additional $1.2 billion worth of food from farmers, mainly things like nuts, fruits, dairy products that they are going ahead and distributing in addition to all the other products to food banks.
Fisher says food banks were a response to the crisis of the 1980s.
The first food bank was kind of founded in the late 60s in Phoenix, Arizona. Until about 1980, 81, there were very few food banks around the country. There was a handful of those that had kind of built off of that model. In the early 80s, they really began to take off. And they took off because there was a kind of a perfect storm that happened in the country. President Reagan came into power and slashed the food stamp program. There was a deep recession, high unemployment. So just for example, I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which was a steel kind of epicenter of steel production. In 1981, the bottom fell out of the steel industry, and all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of steel workers who are unemployed. So you had churches and labor unions and civic associations were coming together following this food bank model and distributing food to unemployed workers and to folks who were hurt by the recession and who could no longer rely on a robust food stamp program. At that point is when food banks really began to take hold and really began to start growing. It was kind of the early 80s onward. It was part of what academics call neoliberalism, kind of moving the core functions of the government onto the private sector with the assumption that communities can do things better than the government can do, and abdicating the role of the government in providing for the right to food for the public.
But Fisher says the corporate for-profit aspects of American food banks has led to the poor being targeted with especially unhealthy things to eat, what just happens to be unsaleable in a supermarket.
At kind of a wholesale level, we have food banks. So we have 200-ish food banks around the country that aggregate product. They get product from supermarkets and from food processors and are buying it and get the TFAP food from the government, and they distribute it out to agencies, if you will, at a kind of a retail level, kind of the pantry that you see in a church. And the vast majority of those pantries are religiously affiliated, with a place of worship. However, at that kind of food bank level, at those kind of regional 200 regional entities, those became over time quickly integrated into the corporate food system. So from my perspective now, they're very much downstream appendages of the food industry. When there's waste in the food industry, either at the supermarket level or Kraft makes a run of some product that they can't sell, or they're mislabeled, or it's off for some reason. Instead of getting that stuff getting thrown into a landfill, it goes to a food bank. So they've become very dependent upon corporate waste, whether it's post-supermarket or post-food process. The quality of food is improving dramatically at food banks because they're putting more and more produce into the system. Some of it is perfectly fine; it's just mislabeled or misshaped or what have you, and some of it is kind of the treatise of the food system. Some of it is wilted lettuce. Some of it is milk that's about to expire. Some of it is kind of almost green meat. I mean, there are food safety requirements, but there is a lot of junk in the food system. But a quarter to a third of the food that goes through food banks is blatantly unhealthy. And by what I mean by that, it's chips, it's pastries, it's candy, it's soda, it's snack foods. It's stuff that's just kind of crappy. And the kind of the quintessential story with food pantries and with kind of junk food is that they get an awful lot of birthday cakes, an awful lot of sheet cakes, because supermarkets overproduce. They want to have variety for people to buy. Nobody wants to buy the last one on the shelf. And so at the end of the day, they can't sell them. So what do they do with them? They ship them out to the food pantry. So you hear food pantries constantly complaining about, Jesus, we have way too many baked goods. Our community has a high diabetes rates. Last thing they need is more sugar. And this is what we're getting, and we're not allowed to refuse it because of the rules that we've signed up to with our food bank and with the food bank, the National Food Bank Hub, Feeding America. When I refer to food system, I mean, the kind of the system of production and distribution and retailing in our country. Everything that's being produced in the country at the farm level, the food processors, the manufacturers, and then the retailers and the distributors. So what I mean is that waste is built into that system. Food is cheap. The U.S. Americans spend the lowest percentage of their budget on food of any country. So when food is cheap, we can afford to throw it out. When food is expensive and you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to waste it.
And at the heart of the American food crisis, Fisher says, is not so much food, but unaffordable housing, which eats up the food budget of the poor.
The wages in the U.S. are not, are bifurcated. Many folks are doing well in the middle class and upper middle class, and other folks are struggling. They're having a hard time getting full-time work, or they're having a hard time getting anything more than minimum wage, and then they're faced with high costs of living. As you know, in New York City, the cost of housing is outrageous. So you find people spending 50, 60, 70% of their budgets on having a roof over their head. If you want to do something about hunger, probably the best place to put your effort in is affordable housing. We all have one budget, one wallet. We pay for all of our expenses in that one wallet. And if you can lower the cost of transportation or electricity or housing, you can create more money for people to spend on food.
And that's Andy Fisher, author of Big Hunger, The Unholy Alliance Between Corporate America and Anti-Hunger Groups. He's a longtime food activist based in Portland, Oregon. And finally, flu season is coming. For most, it's a couple of miserable days off from work. For millions, the pinch of a flu shot. But 100 years ago today marks one of the worst disease pandemics in world history. The influenza spread in a matter of weeks around the globe in the aftermath of World War I, the devastating and deadly illness causing panic equal to the war itself, although today the epidemic is barely remembered. John Barry is author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. He says there's no reason a similar catastrophe couldn't happen today.
The peak of it was almost exactly 100 years ago to the day. Killed between 50 and 100 million people. Just for population, that would be between 225 million and 450 million people today. Most of those people died within a period of about 3 months. And probably 2/3 of the dead were people who were otherwise healthy, young adults, aged from like 18 to 40, 45, something like that, which is one of the great mysteries. Normally, influenza kills infants and the elderly. In 1918, the elderly escaped almost untouched. The excess mortality, 95, 99% even of the excess mortality was people under the age of 65. So it was an unusual pandemic. It actually wasn't the only highly lethal influenza pandemic that's occurred in history. There's one in 1580 that made it from Asia to Africa to Europe and even to the Americas. There was another one in 1688 across much of Europe that crossed the ocean to the Americas. Smallpox was the biggest killer of Native Americans in both North and South America, but influenza came in second. There was a first wave of disease that occurred in the spring, and just like the 2009 pandemic, the disease was hit or miss. A few cities were hit somewhat hard. Other cities were skipped entirely. Los Angeles didn't have a single influenza death in the spring of 1918. New York had hundreds die. Chicago was hit. But the spring wave was still relatively mild, not something that attracted much attention at the time, or it did attract attention, but it didn't seem like a lethal threat at the time. And then the virus seemed to, and nobody quite understands how the virus changed genetically. It seems very similar, the spring and fall viruses, but for some reason, the fall virus became lethal. The overall case mortality in the West was probably only about 2%. In some subgroups, like pregnant women, it was vastly higher. Like there are studies that say different studies from 23% to 71% case mortality for pregnant women. It would start with an attack like ordinary influenza that everybody is familiar with. You never knew whether you were going to have just an ordinary attack or whether you were going to get really, really sick. Some people died within 24 hours. Some of the symptoms were horrific. Unlike any other influenza, you could bleed not only from your nose and mouth, but actually from your eyes and ears. Pretty scary. People were turning so dark blue from lack of oxygen that doctors were actually saying they had difficulty distinguishing African American soldiers from white soldiers. The context in terms of a public health response, the government, the U.S. government, wanted everything to be positive. Every news item was always supposed to be positive. Keep morale up, get morale up. As a result, the public health authorities, both national and local, lied. They said this is ordinary influenza by another name. You have nothing to fear if ordinary precautions are taken. Nothing was done to interfere with the morale of the community. Statements like that. For example, in Philadelphia, which was one of the hardest hit cities, when they finally banned all public gatherings, canceled all sporting events, closed all schools, closed all saloons, closed vaudeville theaters, closed movie theaters, banned churches from having services, one of the newspapers actually said, "You have no reason for alarm. This is not a public health measure." So given the horrific symptoms, given that people are dying all around you, given that the government is finally closing everything down, how stupid did they think people were? People could figure out pretty rapidly that they were being lied to. And I think that definitely increased the amount of fear that was extant throughout the country.
And 100 years ago today, the world was reeling in terror from a disease epidemic that seemed to mark the end of civilization itself. While scientists tried to understand what was happening, the pandemic petered out of its own accord. You've been listening to The Torch on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo.